Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time to see then what is making the headlines with the political editors of the Daily Mirror and The Sun, Pippa, Crerar and Harry Cole, who both join us from the Labour Party conference in Brighton. Welcome to both of you. Plenty to talk about, so let's check out the newspapers, their front pages, starting with the Metro. Britain gets back on board. Their front page reads as commuters begin choosing trains and buses over their cars amid the long queues at petrol stations. The Eye writing about tonight's developments that the army could be called up to help tackle the fuel crisis. The Financial Times also running with the fuel crisis story. They say that the health service could be at risk because of a lack of fuel. The Daily Telegraph with a similar angle, saying that some petrol stations could be reserved for key workers. The Times also writing about key workers getting priority too at the pumps. Yorkshire Post writes about a joint statement between fuel companies and the government, urging people to not to buy fuel in excess. The Guardian front page has the comments made by German election frontrunner Olaf Scholz, who says Brexit is to blame for the UK's fuel crisis. So let's get the initial thoughts then of Pippa and Harry down at the Labour Party conference in Brighton. More of that to come. But first of all, the government finally deciding that it will put the army on standby. Harry, a sign, do you think, that this is really now being taken seriously, or just the optics of looking like they're doing something?
Well, I think if you're talking about optics, it hasn't been a great day for the government. We had George Eustace, the Environment Secretary, out this morning saying there is no crisis, there is no shortage, just a shortage of fuel in the pumps. And I think anyone driving past a petrol station in the last 72 hours will know how sort of out of touch that looked. Then he said there were no immediate plans to send in the army, and yet tonight we know that the Business Department has given a formal request to the Ministry of Defence, which has been signed off by the Defence Secretary, for 150 tanker drivers. We're told we need specialist training to be able to use tankers and handle such flammable liquids, but they will be ready to begin service perhaps as soon as the end of the week. Now, the government will be hoping that by then those that are going to go out and choose to panic buy will be smugly back at home with a full tank, and things will get back to normal if everything just calms down. But there's a big gap, I think, tonight between the government's hope and the government's rhetoric and the reality that people are seeing on the forecourts.
Yes, and all of this amidst this idea that HGV drivers from abroad can come in and fix this problem, you know, the temporary visa issue we heard about over the weekend. But it's a very short period of time they could come. It may well be that they can't even get accommodation for such a short period of time, up to Christmas. And the suggestion from the Eye that these HGV drivers from abroad not expected to arrive until at least the end of October, which by then, hopefully, this will all have calmed down, Pippa.
Well, that's right. The government is hoping, of course, that this all settles down in the next few days, because the problem is not, of course, the lack of fuel in the refineries or the storage facilities. It's the lack of fuel actually in the pumps, and the fact that people have inevitably, really, having been told not to panic buy, gone out and done exactly that. But once everyone's tanks are full and they realise that there isn't going to be a longer-term shortage, then hopefully the next few days the pumps will be able to refill and the immediate crisis will be over. But there is obviously ongoing issues with not just supply of fuel, but obviously supply goods to supermarkets and all sorts of other things resulting from the driver shortage. The problem is, of course, that if the government is desperate to avoid these supply issues manifesting themselves in the run-up to Christmas and causing big problems then they're going to really have to get a bit of a move on. And as the Eye suggests, it's going to be end of October before these drivers start to arrive. There's only 5,000 visas being issued in the first instance, a suggestion that there's a shortage of 100,000 drivers. So I can't see it being resolved either very quickly or when the new drivers come, if they come, whether that's going to be enough to plug some of the gaps.
All sorts of blame being floated around today and over the weekend, Harry, blaming the public for panic buying, blaming the whistleblower who revealed that one forecourt or one chain of forecourts had an HGV shortage and was having to close a couple of petrol stations. But fundamentally, do you think this has acted as sort of direct action from the consumer to raise something which the government's been told about for several months, which is this HGV driver shortage, which hauliers have been banging on about?
Absolutely. I mean, we've been running a campaign, I think, since July in the Sun to get more British HGV licences available, get more people training as HGV drivers. This shouldn't have come as a shock to the government. It's been a sort of slow motion, to coin a phrase, car crash for them. There has clearly been a bit of a mess up, I think, by the Road Haulers Association, by the large hauliers in this country who have been desperately trying to pressure behind the scenes for the last 6 or so months. This idea, to get the government to soften their line on the amount of visas that are given to European drivers to come here. There has been a furious row going on for several months behind the scenes, and it does feel to me a little bit like they were playing, both sides were slightly playing with fire in this. They've pushed themselves to the brink. In their sort of, they wanted to put a little bit of pressure on the government, but no one wanted it to be this full-scale panic. But the genie's out of the bottle now, and it's up to ministers to try and calm things down. But you've got, the Environment Secretary saying don't panic, literally on television. And post-COVID, I think, the British public have been told lots of mixed messages over the last 18 months. And I think, a government minister saying don't panic, everything's going to be fine, isn't quite what it used to be, I'd say, 2 years ago. So, you're seeing a sort of a reaping of what has been sown over the last year or so of mixed messages and confusion around the pandemic. And actually, people don't quite believe the government in a way that they might have done before when they say, don't worry, there's loads of fuel, carry on with your day. People want to take the law into their own hands.
Yes, I mean, even funeral directors suggesting that funerals might have to be cancelled because they can't get the fuel they need for hearses. Daily Telegraph, of course, reporting the clamour to get key workers to the front of the pumps. Is that likely to happen? Might that be mandated? Certainly George Eustace tonight on the Sky Showcase, Sky News News show, The Great Debate, suggested that would be down to individual companies and individual organisations. How that would work, I've no idea.
Yeah, and the suggestion from Downing Street earlier was that that is not on the cards for now. But as we also know, things have changed very quickly. We were told as recently this morning that the Army were only going to be involved when it came to training HGV drivers, not actually distributing fuel themselves. So, this is a fast-evolving situation. I think, really, though, the government will be keen to see whether it calms down by the weekend. If, as we said earlier, people's petrol tanks are full and there's no sort of pressure, there's time for the fuel companies to refill their stocks at the petrol stations, then possibly it won't be needed. But, it's not just funeral directors. There's a whole load of key workers, some people who, community nurses. There's people that rely on before you even get to people that rely on having fuel and being able to drive around for their businesses, deliveries and so on. There's a whole load of people that are going to be desperately in need, such as ambulance drivers and, fire emergency vehicles. You'd like to think that they'd be top of the list anyway. But, this has happened before in this country. Hark back to 2000. I mean, I clearly had only just passed my test then. But there was obviously a fuel shortage then, and such measures were deployed as making sure that key workers were front of the line. And I think if this does go on beyond the weekend, there'll be an expectation, not just from the key workers themselves, but from the public who rely on them, that happens. So I would expect the government to move on that quite quickly, should we get past the weekend and the situation not have improved.
Yeah, the Telegraph saying that bin collections are starting to be cancelled as well. The UK kind of does grind to a halt, doesn't it, if you can't get somewhere in the vehicle, despite, I think it was the Metro front page saying everyone's going back to public transport. From my point of view, the roads were certainly quite a lot emptier today than they have been in the last week or so. But is there an inevitability, Harry, do you think, that certain key workers will have to be prioritised in this way?
If this continues, and also I think speaking to people in Whitehall, back in Whitehall today, there is an expectation that this is, they might get through this week and it might return to normal, but this might rear its head again and again. And as you say, when people are back on the trains and things, all it takes was a couple of days of snow thrown into this one, and you've got proper full-on lockdown and chaos. I thought the point Pippa made there was really interesting, and I had dinner tonight, I have to say, with a very senior former member of the last Labour government who said they still have chills down their spine when they think about that fuel crisis in 2002, and it seared the government, that former government, in such a way that into the lead up to the economic crash, it was actually the biggest jolt they had, and it takes a long time for the public to regain trust that, such basic things as being able to go fill up and drive to do a day's work it's a basic competence judgment on the government. So while they might get the pumps reopened in the next 72 hours and things flowing, and they might get through this winter without more bumps, it might take a little bit longer, a very long tail, for sort of trust in the government's competence to recover from this. And it's a little bit unfair, is it the government's fault entirely? But, people make these judgments very quickly, and if they can't get to work, they're going to be blaming the Tories very quickly.
Yeah, if it continues is the great unknown, isn't it? Certainly the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, in the statement from the government tonight about the army on standby, said we are starting to see panic buying moderate with more grades of fuel now available at more petrol stations. So that is what they hope will continue. The question as to the cause of this issue, the HGV, the fundamental HGV issue, The Guardian, Brexit to blame for UK's fuel crisis, says the frontrunner to succeed Merkel, the Olaf Scholz, who is waiting to see if he can form a coalition government. This will be subject of debate and no doubt reflection, but there are many reasons, are there not, why there is an HGV shortage, Pippa, don't you think?
Yes, of course. It's not just down to the immigration rules that came in after Brexit, or lots of Eastern European lorry drivers deciding they didn't want to come here. I mean, another reason is sort of comparisons of wages and conditions between here and the continent, and actually I think it's more lucrative, and the conditions in terms of rest facilities and so on are better in the continent than they are here. But it's definitely a factor, and it's actually quite interesting when you sort of look at some of the issues which have been caused in part by Brexit, how actually it isn't really being spoken about much. This is a German politician talking about it. We're not hearing the Labour Party, for example, say that Brexit's to blame. We're certainly not hearing members of the government saying that Brexit is a factor. In fact, they're denying that it's a factor. There is still this sort of feeling that the Brexit wars were so divisive and so difficult that nobody really wants to quite go back there and revisit them. But it is the case that Brexit was in part a reason for the situation we're now in. And, I don't think people should be afraid of acknowledging that. Brexit isn't perfect. I don't think even the government would argue...
Brexit is also a process rather than a destination, and this is going to be an inevitable part of the teething process. But I thought what was really interesting this morning was Rachel Reeves on her media round today very explicitly saying, this is the Labour's Shadow Chancellor, very explicitly saying, no, we won't be bringing back free movement. No, that argument is done. We can look at tinkering around the edges, but wholesale free movement is a done deal, and it's not coming back. But also, I think newly elected German socialist politician having a pop at Brexit, I don't think it's going to do any bad standing at home. You've got to look to his audience he's playing at. He's not necessarily talking to a domestic British audience with those jibes. So good luck to him.
Yeah, that's a win-win for his own domestic audience, is it not, as he tries to form a coalition? The Guardian does point out, in fact, that a number of EU member states, including Germany, have a long-standing HGV driver shortage. Poland is the worst, with 124,000 drivers short. UK next, 60,000 to 76,000, and Germany 45,000 to 60,000. But they say, unlike the UK, companies in European Union member states have been able to rely on nationals from their neighbours to fill the gaps. That, they say, is the difference. Anyway, plenty more still to come in this part of the show, including The Guardian writes about sabotage claims as Labour's Andy MacDonald resigns. Of course, our two guests tonight from Brighton and the Labour Party conference will have more on that in just a moment.
Well, Luke got furloughed. He was my husband around about the end of last year, October, November time. And within that time frame, he developed a gambling disorder. I didn't know about any of this until Luke had sadly taken his own life. 3 weeks later, I received his phone and I was able to log into certain things, and slowly I then started to get a picture of what had happened, and he had developed that gambling disorder, like I said. Looking further into his accounts, free bets had been dropping in at times when he'd put money in and he'd lost it. He'd lost quite a lot of money, and then a free bet went in And then Luke would then get another loan, put that in, lose it, the money had gone, another free bet had go in, and it kind of developed and just progressed basically until he lost control and he just couldn't take it anymore. It was so difficult because that first 3 weeks of him passing away, obviously when someone takes their own life, you do question yourself. You think, well, you know, what did I do? The kids were doing the same thing. We've got 2 children together. His family were all questioning what we'd done, what had happened. And it was literally when we got his phone back, the police gave me his phone and I was able to log into certain accounts, his PayPal. The money was going from PayPal into gambling accounts. I don't look at the money situation, to be fair, because he lost his life. It was a lot of money. It was not affordable, and it was why he was funding it with loans, because he couldn't afford it. It wasn't something he could use his wages on. Gambling is a really harmful product. It's addictive. It's more addictive than class A drugs such as heroin, and you can lose everything within minutes. So yeah, the free bets, it's an inducement that is just so unnecessary. I feel like they just shouldn't be available. I mean, luckily I've been really looked after by a charity called Gambling with Lives. They have been amazing and they have really taken care of me. Every day is hard, and every day I'm going to have to live with the fact that he's no longer here.
We don't understand that every lake or a pond is a habitat in itself, which houses frogs, snakes, crabs, turtles, birds, so many different life forms. Human beings directly depend on underground water source. So a lake or a pond is necessary to replenish these groundwater resources.
Cercando as áreas, limpando as áreas e progressivamente avançando com os plantios. Isso daqui é uma sentença de morte para os manguezais.
Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. I'm joined now from the Labour Party conference in Brighton by Pippa Crerar and Harry Cole from the Mirror and Sun, respectively. Welcome back to both of you. So The Guardian talks about the big news from there, Pippa, the resignation of a front bencher, and suggesting it might have been sabotage in its article. Tell us more.
Well, the first couple of days of Labour conference have got off to a bit of a bumpy start. We had Angela Rayner, of course, talking about describing Tory cabinet ministers as scum, and then we had the almighty row over rule changes for the Labour Party, which were eventually won by Keir Starmer. And just as they thought that everything was going to calm down a bit, Andy MacDonald, who's this fairly junior shadow cabinet minister, the only remaining Corbynite left in the shadow cabinet, quits, ostensibly over a minimum wage row. But I think we all know that it wasn't really much to do with that. It was that he didn't feel comfortable as being the only sort of standard bearer of the left in shadow cabinet, had concerns about the rule change. And when you look at people that have applauded his departure tonight, like Sir John McDonnell and various union leaders, ex-union leaders, you see that he really is sort of a bit of the party that's no longer represented amongst the leadership and probably just wanted out.
Yes, on the front page there we saw Rachel Reeves. It was her big day, wasn't it, today, Harry? What did you pick up from that, and has this overshadowed what she had to say?
No, not really. I think I won't be telling secrets out of school too much to say when the wires snapped, Andy MacDonald has resigned. There was a sort of a whisper, a murmur of who around the press room here in Brighton. But look, I mean, I think, you know, deep down, big picture, if you ask Keir Starmer, you know, whether he'd have got his leadership changes through that he was desperate to do last year but couldn't because there wasn't a conference, and doesn't want to be doing next year because it would be an election cycle by then, whether he got those through, whether, you know, Jeremy Corbyn is a sort of almost a fringe figure here, sort of on the outskirts of the conference, not drawing anywhere near the crowds He has drawn previously at these affairs. And a relatively unknown, if a little grumpy, shadow cabinet member retiring to the backbenches. You can see why some of the people around Keir and his supporters kind of see it as a net win.